The man stood quietly in the corner of the room, unnoticed among the crowd gathered at the funeral. But when the truth about him, a soldier who had sacrificed himself for his comrades in war, was finally revealed, no one could believe what they had overlooked. How could a hero be forgotten to such an extent, especially at the funeral of the man he had saved? As the secrets were unveiled, the crowd was stunned by the truth about him, and they were forced to confront the painful reality, how wrong they had been not to recognize the worth of this man. What happens when a long-buried story of sacrifice is uncovered? The unexpected conclusion will leave you reflecting on how we perceive those around us. Stay tuned to discover what changes when the truth comes to light. The story begins. The cemetery was quiet and still, only interrupted by the soft breeze rustling through the trees and the faint hum of distant traffic. Mourners stood in small groups, their faces somber, their voices hushed in reverence. Stories of the deceased floated in the air, light laughter mingling with stifled sobs as memories were shared. But there was one man standing apart, an elderly black man, his suit worn at the edges, gripping his old frayed cap tightly. His posture was rigid, his gaze fixed on the casket. He stood further away from the others, not by choice, but because of something unspoken. He didn't belong here, or at least that's what the whispers seemed to say. Some people glanced at him briefly, their faces betraying curiosity and discomfort. A few avoided his gaze entirely, as if his mere presence shattered the sanctity of the moment. A woman leaned toward her friend, her voice barely a whisper, but clear enough for him to hear, "What's he doing here?" The man heard, but his expression didn't change. His eyes remained locked on the casket. His spine straightened a bit more, his grip on his cap tightened, and though he hesitated for a step forward, the weight of the crowd's stares, the unspoken judgment, kept him in place. He stood still, his gaze unwavering from the casket, his face unreadable. There was sadness, yes, but something deeper too, something resolute, as though he had a reason to be here, a reason no one else could understand. No one offered him comfort, no one invited him closer. He seemed invisible. Yet he didn't leave. He couldn't. Something was holding him here, tethering him to this moment, to this funeral, to the man lying in the casket. This was no ordinary funeral. This was the beginning of a story no one expected, one woven with themes of discrimination and resilience, a story about a buried truth and a revelation that would leave everyone stunned and forever changed. The funeral began. The elderly man stood quietly behind, his eyes scanning the faces of the mourners. They exchanged comforting words, sad smiles lingering on their lips, leaning on one another in grief. But no one did that with him. He adjusted his worn coat. The fabric stretched tight with age, gripped his cap a little harder. He tried to move closer to the crowd, but the slightest shift in their body language stopped him. A fleeting glance, a turn of the body, just enough to make him feel that his presence was a disruption. The preacher's voice rang out, emotional words about the deceased, a life full of accomplishments and community love. The man's expression softened when the name of the deceased was mentioned, a faint smile crossing his lips, but no one noticed. Someone in the front row glanced back at him quickly, furrowing her brow, then leaned toward another woman, whispering something. They glanced at him, narrowing their eyes, then turned back to the preacher. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to blend into the background, but he didn't leave. He couldn't. Something kept him there, staring at the casket, as if it held not just the body of the deceased, but the answers to why he was here in the first place. That morning, the drive to the cemetery had been uneventful. The road stretched ahead, his mind lost in memories. But suddenly, the flashing red and blue lights in the rearview mirror snapped him back to reality. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he pulled over. The officers approached his car with an air of authority and disdain. "Driver's license and registration," the man shouted without greeting. The elderly man silently handed over his papers to the officer, saying, "Yes, sir." his voice still steady, though a growing sense of unease stirred within him. The officer scrutinized the documents for a moment before glancing up, his gaze searching the interior of the car as though hoping to find something that could incriminate him. "What are you doing here?" the officer asked, his tone full of suspicion. "I'm on my way to a funeral," the elderly man replied simply, his hand resting calmly on the steering wheel so the officer could see it clearly. The officer smirked. "A funeral, huh? Quite the place for someone like you. You sure you're in the right place?" The elderly man didn't respond. He kept his gaze straight ahead, his face calm but resolute. The officer waited for a moment longer, his sharp eyes probing, as though he was trying to find a reason to dismiss the man. Finally, he waved dismissively, returning the documents. "Don't cause any trouble," the officer muttered as he turned and walked back to his patrol car. Standing at the edge of the road, the elderly man heard those words echoing in his mind. He considered driving away, leaving, escaping the silent rejection that weighed on him like an unbearable burden. But then his eyes drifted back to the casket. No, he couldn't leave. Not now. As the funeral continued, his mind returned to that moment with the officer earlier that morning. A moment still lingering like a bitter taste in his mouth. He could still feel the officer's gaze, one that didn't see him as a person, but as a problem to be dealt with. The officer's final words echoed in his mind, "Don't cause any trouble." A bitter smile flickered at the corners of his lips. Trouble? The only trouble he'd ever caused was living long enough to witness a world that repeatedly rejected him. He hadn't always been invisible. There was a time when his presence was respected, when his actions had meaning, life-saving meaning. Those memories now felt distant, buried beneath layers of quiet patience. But as he stood there, staring at the casket, those memories flooded back, clearer than ever. He remembered that moment, years ago, in a foreign land, surrounded by chaos, the sound of gunfire, smoke filling the air. He could still feel the weight of the man on his shoulder, his body rigid, blood-soaked, as he ran across an open field, exposed in the middle of a bullet storm. Bullets whizzed by, dirt sprang up, cutting through the air just inches from his head. He still remembered the sharp pain when a bullet grazed his arm. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. To stop meant neither of them would escape. The preacher's voice broke through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. "We gather here today to honor a man who lived a long and full life," the preacher said. "A man who touched the lives of many in this community, a man who was always there when his friends, family, and country needed him." The elderly man's heart tightened at those words. He knew the deceased better than anyone here, better than even family or the preacher. And yet he stood there, alone, unseen. He took a deep breath, trying to shake the feeling, but it was too heavy. This wasn't just about today. It was about every moment like this, every quiet rejection, every glance that silently said, "You don't belong here." Then the preacher's tone shifted, taking on a new nuance that caused the elderly man to lift his head. But his story, like all great stories, cannot be complete without mentioning the sacrifices of those who stood by his side. A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd as the preacher continued. "Many of you may not know, but during his service, our brother, the one we honor today, faced an incredibly dangerous moment. His life had hung by a thread between life and death, and it was through the courage and sacrifice of another that he had made it back to his family." A sudden murmur ran through the funeral. The elderly man's hands trembled as he gripped his hat tightly. Could it be? Did the deceased truly remember him? For years he had convinced himself that his actions had been forgotten, that his sacrifice had been buried along with the horrific memories of those days. The preacher pointed toward the crowd. "And that man, the one who brought him to safety, who sacrificed his life to ensure his survival and his return to his family, is standing right here among us." The whispers grew louder, eyes turning, searching. The elderly man felt all eyes suddenly fix on him. The weight of their scrutiny was immense, but he remained still, his mind spinning. The preacher's voice rang out clearly. "It is the man who saved him, who ensured he lived to become the man we honor today, who stands among us now." All the whispers, the contemptuous glances, the judgment, it all stopped. Silence enveloped the space, reverberating like an explosion. The elderly man stood motionless, his heart pounding, unsure of what to say or do. For the first time since arriving, all the gazes were not filled with disdain, but with admiration. The preacher nodded toward him, a faint smile on his lips. "Mr. Johnson, we thank you for your courage and sacrifice. Because of you, he lived to become the man we honor today." The elderly man's lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but no words came. He looked around, seeing faces now gazing at him with respect, admiration, even regret. The shift in their eyes was so powerful that he could hardly bear it. He felt the weight of all the years of invisibility slowly fade, replaced by something he hadn't felt in a long time: recognition. The silence lingered, heavy and filled with meaning, as the preacher's words sank deep into everyone's hearts. A relative of the deceased, a middle-aged woman, hesitated before stepping toward him. Her eyes were wide, shining with gratitude and remorse. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice trembling, "I didn't know. None of us knew. I'm so sorry." Her apology, stammered yet sincere, broke the dam that had been holding back the emotions of those around them. An older man in tears spoke up. "You're the reason he came back to us. You're the reason he lived to build a family, a community. We owe you everything." Finally, the elderly man found his voice again, though it was soft and unsteady. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said, his gaze drifting away from the casket. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. He was my brother out there, and I'd do it again if I had to." The atmosphere at the funeral gradually lightened, replaced by something warm, a sense of healing. People began to approach him, one by one, offering apologies, gratitude, and even shedding tears. The woman who had initially ignored him now tightly embraced him, whispering through her sobs, "Thank you. Thank you for bringing him back to us." For the first time that day, the elderly man felt like he belonged. The weight that had pressed on him since he arrived, the judgment, the loneliness, was gone. In its place was a sense of connection, of being seen. As the service drew to a close, the family invited him to stand with them at the front, beside the casket of the man he had saved so many years ago. They asked him to share a few words, to help them remember the deceased not just as a father, husband, or friend, but as a soldier who survived because of one brave act. The elderly man stepped forward, his hand still trembling slightly, but his voice steady. "We served together in a time when division was everywhere," he began, "but out there, in the chaos, none of that mattered. We weren't black or white. We were just men fighting to survive, fighting for each other. And on that day, I didn't think about his skin color. I thought about the promise I made to him and to all the men out there, that I would do whatever it took to bring us home." His voice caught, and he paused for a moment to regain his composure. The crowd was utterly still, hanging on to each word he spoke. "We live in a world still struggling to look beyond the things that divide us," he continued. "But I'm here to tell you that in the most important moments, those differences don't matter. What matters is how we choose to show up for each other, how we choose to see each other, how we choose to treat each other." The elderly man stepped back, his words lingering in the air like a prayer. The crowd stood motionless, many with tears in their eyes, not only because of the story, but because of the truth he had spoken. As the service began to wind down, some of the attendees stayed behind to thank him again, shaking his hand, offering apologies. For the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider, but part of something larger than himself. When he stood by his car, watching the family slowly disperse, he felt a warmth he hadn't known in a long time, a sense of recognition, not just for what he had done, but for who he was, The image of the little girl hugging him lingered in his mind. Her innocence, her genuine, unguarded gratitude, stood in stark contrast to the looks of contempt he had endured throughout the day. He turned to glance one final time at the casket. His mind returned to the war, to the day he made the decision to save the man now being buried. It hadn't been easy. He could still feel the pain in his leg, the exhaustion as he carried the wounded soldier through a hail of gunfire, but he had never regretted it. He hadn't done it for medals or recognition. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. And even after all these years, he still wondered, could anything have changed? Had his sacrifices been forgotten, obscured by a world too focused on its differences to recognize what truly mattered? The shared humanity that connected us all today served as a painful reminder, yet it also became something more. It was a moment of reflection, of discovery, and ultimately, of hope. As he climbed into his car, he noticed a few people from the funeral waving goodbye from the cemetery gate. They were different now, not just in their actions, but in their eyes. In their eyes, there was humility, a quiet recognition for the man they had once overlooked. It wasn't enough to erase the years of invisibility he had endured, but it was a beginning. As he drove away, his mind was heavy, yet filled with hope. The road ahead seemed longer, but also brighter, as though something significant had shifted, not just for him, but for everyone who had been at the funeral that day. He hoped they would carry this lesson with them, share it with others, and work together to create a world where no one has to prove their worth, to be treated with dignity. The elderly man whispered to himself, as if speaking to the deceased, "Rest in peace, my friend. Maybe this time they'll remember what truly matters." This story is not just about one man. It is about all of us, about the prejudices, the assumptions, and the walls we build between each other. Racism is not only about loud acts of hatred. It is about the quiet moments when someone is ignored, dismissed, or treated as less than human. It's in the fleeting glances, the whispered words, and the silence that allows it to grow. But today, we saw something different. We saw what happens when the truth is brought into the light, when we are forced to confront our own biases and recognize the humanity we have overlooked. The man they had ignored was not just a hero in war, he was a hero in life. And heroes like him walk among us every day, unseen, uncelebrated. It's time we start seeing them. This is a call to action. Look beyond appearances, beyond stereotypes, and beyond the stories we tell ourselves about who is worthy and who is not. Recognize the contributions, sacrifices, and humanity of every person, no matter who they are, where they come from, or what their circumstances are. The world won't change without us. It changes when we choose to see each other, when we choose to listen, learn, and act. Today they finally saw the man who had been invisible for so long. Let's make sure we don't need another funeral to open our eyes. Let's see each other, respect each other, and become better, because the world is watching us, and it all starts with us. The elderly man continued to drive, the sun setting behind him, casting golden rays across the road ahead. And for the first time in a long while, he felt seen, not for what he had done, but for who he was. That, more than anything, gave him hope for the future. This story serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of recognition and mutual respect. Have you ever experienced a moment when the truth was revealed and everything changed? Are you willing to stand up for what is right, even in the face of difficulty and judgment? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your stories can inspire others and bring about positive change. If this story resonates with you, don't hesitate to share it with your friends and loved ones. Together, we can spread the message of respect, empathy, and human awareness in our society. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Let's work together to create change, even in small ways, to make the world a better place. Wishing you strength, joy, and hope always. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared with the intention of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any mistakes, kindly overlook them with understanding. Wishing you all of the best in life.